Good afternoon, and welcome to the Introduction to Confidential Financial Disclosure. My name is Patrick Shepard, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by Cheryl Kane-Piasecki. Welcome, Cheryl.
Thanks, Patrick.
So today we're going to be talking about part one of our sort of 450 introduction to the system and the forms and the review process and all that. So this is really appropriate if you're new to confidential financial disclosure, if you're new to some of the resources, or if you just want a refresher for the coming filing season.
Absolutely. The three-part series that we're offering this week and next is to provide you basically with a foundational and comprehensive introduction to confidential financial disclosure, the system, the administrative aspects of the program, along with the form itself and the review function. I think that we've had some changes to the confidential financial disclosure regulations. The revisions went into effect in January 1st, I believe, of 2019. So consequently, many of the materials that we had available in the Institute for Ethics in Government have been superseded by those changes. And so we are, in effect, rebuilding the content that we had on the site. So we wanted to start rebuilding our confidential financial disclosure portfolio by providing you with some fundaments, as it were, to the system that you all are going to have to be administering come February.
That makes a lot of sense with the changes to the regulation, the changes to the system. Some of the materials we had on the Institute for Ethics in Government were a little old, outdated. So this is a good opportunity to refresh our materials, but also to introduce you to some of the new materials that are available to help you.
And one of the primary objectives that we have is to also familiarize you with the Confidential Financial Disclosure Guide, the OGE Form 450 Guide. This is going to be kind of the queen of our parade for the next three segments. So we're going to be following along pretty much along the table of contents that you'll see in the guide. So if you look at sections 1, sections 2, and sections 3 of the guide, that will give you a pretty good and clear idea of the content that we're going to be covering over the next 3 sessions. And I would encourage you right now, if you don't have it open and available, to please do so, because at one point during this session, we are going to be actually going into the guide and shepherding you through sections of the guide.
Well, I think that's an important point, because with these online sessions, one of the things we want to do is to prepare you to actually do the work. And when you're doing the work of reviewing confidential financial disclosure reports, this is really the tool you ought to be using. You should keep it on your desk. Those of us who are familiar with the 278 system are familiar with those big binders we all used to keep on our desks. But really going to the resource is important. It's better to do that, even if you think you remember, than to remember from that broadcast I watched a few months ago.
One thing I do want to highlight for you all, too, is the revisions that were made to this guide were done with a view to trying to create a compendium and kind of a one-stop shop of resources for you to make reference to when you're doing your financial disclosure review, but also just when you also have questions about the system generally. So this guide, this revised guide, includes a lot of the information that had previously been available from a variety of sources, including a frequently asked questions document and some other resources that we had on our website that, again, were outdated. So we've just tried to incorporate much, if not all, of that information into this one document so that, again, it's mostly one-stop shopping. So no matter what your role is in the financial disclosure system, we're hoping that you will take part in these 3 separate series, because the problem with the confidential financial disclosure system, as it is with the public financial disclosure system, is that it consists of many different parts. There are many different aspects to the system, all of which have to work together towards the common purpose of the system. And so if you only have one little piece of the puzzle, let's say that your only job is to do an initial review of a 450, it's supremely important that you understand where your piece of the puzzle fits into the larger puzzle. because that way it'll enable you to make sure your processes are efficient, to make sure that your analyses are serving the purpose, the overarching purpose of the confidential financial disclosure system.
And I think that's an important point about the confidential system in particular, is that it is very purposive in its composition. Almost all of the decisions we make throughout the entire system are designed with one purpose in mind.
Mm-hmm. And what is that purpose? So why I think we need to start with the purpose, the objective. Why do we dedicate time, energy, resources to this system, Patrick? Why is it? What is the importance? Why do we do financial disclosure?
Well, the reason we do financial disclosure is to prevent conflicts of interest. Mm-hmm. That's the only reason. The reason we conduct the confidential system, from how we designate filers to the information on the form to the instructions to the review process, is all designed around this one purpose, and that's to prevent conflicts of interest.
And what do we mean by conflicts of interest?
And I think when we're talking about conflicts of interest, we're talking about the nexus or the improper influence of private interests upon government decision making. So we're really looking for an overlap between the government responsibilities of our filers and their private, personal, financial interests, business arrangements, things like that, so that those outside interests do not improperly influence or sort of pollute their ability to do work on behalf of the government.
So I think that's an important point to keep in mind, that when we're talking about conflicts of interest, first of all, while we are making reference to a criminal statute, we are also talking about it in a broader and more vernacular kind of way, which is to say that the goal, the aim of confidential financial disclosure is to identify work that's being performed by individuals in the organization, and then do our best to protect the integrity of that work from any potential for use of public office for private gain, or somehow misusing your position, individuals misusing their position in order to benefit themselves or others in a private way. So when we're talking about conflicts of interest, I want everyone to be aware that we're talking about a broader concept simply than Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 208.
No, absolutely. When we think about things like the standards of conduct, we're really talking about different sorts of conflicts of interest. When we're talking about the gifts regulations, for example, we're talking about gratuities improperly influencing government work. It's not a criminal conflict of interest per purpose of 208, but it's all the same a kind of conflict of interest.
Exactly. So when we're talking about what it is that the review of the 450 is attempting to do, is we're trying to mitigate this notion of conflicts. And the reason we want to do that is because we're trying to make sure that we're not allowing bias, any form of bias, particularly a pecuniary kind of bias, to be introduced into the decision-making processes that government employees undertake when they're performing their duties, because it does have a concrete harm to the work that we perform. And what are some harms, Patrick, that this is really trying to sort of like forestall?
Well, I think when we think about the kinds of work the government does, lots of work that has an effect on outside entities has the potential to be harmed by conflicts of interest. If we're talking about purchase things through a contract, if we have some sort of bias introduced during the contracting process, we can have bid protests, or we can have investigations or challenges to those source selections. If we're talking about investigations, bias by investigators can lead to the conclusions of investigations being challenged in court or being just called into question simply. Likewise, if we're talking about more broad matters like regulatory matters, if we have those decisions being polluted by private financial interests or other kinds of bias, we could just get bad policy that doesn't achieve the objectives that it's designed to achieve. So really we're talking about the fundamental integrity of the work that we do as government officials.
So what do we need to know to prevent conflicts of interest? We're talking about needing to know, on the one hand, what the work is that our employees are performing. So what we're trying to do in the confidential financial disclosure system is we're trying to identify the areas of greatest risk for the organization. Where is the work being performed, and by whom is the work being performed? Whereas there's the greatest risk for these conflicts of interest, for these biases to be introduced, for things that could somehow affect the integrity of the work, typically we're looking at work that has the ability to affect the interests of an outside organization. So we're really concerned about people who have duties that affect the interests of non-federal entities. So that's one piece of information we're always going to have, and I think we have to keep that in mind, that that's what we're protecting. So we need to know as much as we can possibly know about that when we undertake a review of an OGE Form 450 or another confidential financial disclosure form.
No, absolutely. And I think that's important to keep in mind as you start reviewing forms, is that the information contained on the form is only half of the story. What you as a reviewer need to bring to the table is knowledge and understanding about the work that goes on in your agency. And if for some reason you don't have that information available, you need to somehow get it.
Absolutely. Because then what the employee is bringing to the table in the guise of the OGE Form 450 or another alternative format, which we're going to talk about in a minute, they're bringing the facts, the other piece of information, the other facts that you need in order to be able to determine if there is any potential for a conflict of interest or other ethics concern. And that's financial holdings, outside positions, spousal financial holdings, business relationships that the employee may have. So what they're bringing to you on the 450 is the second critical piece of information that you're going to need in order to be able to do a conflicts analysis. But at the end of the day, I think what you need to be thinking about when you're looking at an OGE Form 450 or another similar form is this is a request for advice and counsel. The employee is coming to you with certain information, and you're being tasked with applying the law to the information that you've been given to determine whether or not there's any possibility that this employee might bump up against either the Criminal Conflict of Interest Statute, 208 or others, or other bodies or other laws and regulations that are with ethical implications. So one way that we could think about the 450 is that it's compulsory advice and counsel.
Right.
What we're doing is we're identifying people who must receive advice and counsel before they proceed to work on matters.
Okay.
So when you're doing your review of your form, I think it's always important for us to remember what the certification statement is that we're attesting to, whether you're the certifying official or whether you're helping to engage in a review that's going to allow the certifying official to make the certification. The certification we make is that I conclude that the filer is in compliance with applicable laws and regulations. So I think it's always important for us to keep that in mind, that that's the end goal, is to be able to certify that you have reviewed the information on the form, and anything that you've reviewed on the form appears that the employee is in compliance with applicable law and regulation. And I've highlighted that there in red. So the applicable laws and regulations as a general proposition, and we're going to be discussing this in more detail when we start talking about the actual review itself, but I think it's important for you to know this is the law that you're going to kind of have under your belt when you're doing a review of an OGE Form 450. The criminal statutes, 18 U.S.C. sections 201 through 209, obviously the standards of conduct at 5 CFR Part 2635, the financial disclosure regulations themselves, which are at 5 CFR 2634. For purposes of confidential, it's under subpart I. And then any agency supplemental regulations that you may have with respect to prior approval for outside activities or prohibited financial holdings, anything that's within the bailiwick of your own supplemental regulations, that's obviously something that you would also be certifying that they are in compliance with.
Okay.
So as a general matter, just so that we're all familiar with the authorities under which we operate, the system operates, the Ethics in Government Act actually discusses the requirement for federal officials to make public disclosures of selected personal financial interests. But it also provided OGE with the authority to establish a confidential financial disclosure system for executive branch employees who may not be subject to public financial disclosure. So OGE's authority to do this comes from the Ethics in Government Act, as well as a separate executive order, 12674. So I think it's just important for us all to be aware of where do we derive the authority to be able to ask people for this information, because we all know that we sometimes get pushback from individuals about, under what authority are you asking ask me for this information, and this is the authority under which OGE has created this system.
Yeah, and I think this is also an important distinction because when we look at the public system, we have almost no discretion about what gets disclosed.
Right.
The statute lays out very clearly exactly the information that's required on the public financial disclosure report. In contrast, the Ethics in Government Act says, OGE, create a confidential system that works. So that's what we've done. So when you look at 2634, that's OGE's effort to collect the information that we think you need in order to make a determination about the potential for conflict of interest under the criminal statutes, the standards of conduct, or any other authorities that you have to look at.
And I think OGE has, in many respects, modeled the confidential system on the public system, for good reason. I mean, it is a model, and it requests the kind of information that we think would be material to a potential conflict of interest or conflict of interest analysis. But we're going to talk a little bit later on about how if that's not serving your purposes, if the form that we've created and the requirements that we have within the context of that form are not serving your purposes. And remember, the purpose is for you to be able to protect the integrity of the programs and operations that you are serving in your agency, that you have some authority to create alternative systems that work better for you. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more later. But again, it's a matter of understanding the entire purpose of this system is to prevent conflicts of interest. And you are best situated to determine how best you can go about making those types of prophylactic determinations. So let's get into one of the key pieces of the system, and this is a really critical part of the OGE Form 450 system. This is what kind of makes or breaks this system with respect to its effectiveness, is who do we have file? Who do we designate as a confidential financial disclosure filer? Why does that matter, Patrick?
No, I think this is really one of the linchpins of the entire executive branch ethics program. This is our primary risk determination, because if we have the wrong people filing 450s, a lot of our program elements don't work properly. And what we're talking about here is making a risk-based determination based on the duties and responsibilities of our employees. So if we're talking about confidential filers, these are people who are below the SES, so GS 15 or equivalent or below, who have responsibilities and duties affecting non-federal entities. So basically, these are the people in shorthand who we're concerned about having the potential for conflicts of interest. They're people whose work can be affected by private interests that may run contrary to the government's interest. And I think one of the really important things here is it's determined by you.
Yes.
This is where agencies decide where to put their resources, where to put the resources to review the 450s, but also who gets mandated to receive annual training, among other things. So this is really your fundamental risk determination about who in your organization really does work that affects outside entities that could be compromised in some way by potential conflicts of interest.
And the regulation itself at 2634.904 has a non-exhaustive list of examples of the kinds of positions and the kinds of duties that might be best suited to, or that should trigger perhaps at least an evaluation about whether or not they should be required to file an OGE Form 450. But those responsibilities and duties, again, are not exhaustive. And the agency, each agency is given the discretion to make the determination, irrespective of what 904 may delineate in the way of some responsibilities and duties, which positions actually, and again, it's a risk calculus. You're making a risk calculation. Which positions present the greatest risk or likelihood for a potential conflict of interest? And then when you flag those positions, then you're basically saying to that employee, again, we're going to require you. This is going to be compulsory advice and counsel. We're going to make you file a 450 so that we can actually make a concrete determination about whether and to what extent that risk is real.
Right. And we didn't leave this determination to the agencies by accident. We did this because you're better situated than we are to understand who in your organization faces these risks. So that's a really important thing. It's a step in the process that your organization should take seriously, because if you get this wrong, it's very difficult to have an effective system.
That's true. And so some of the best people who are positioned to help you with this are, of course, Your supervisors. Supervisors are the ones who are most familiar with what it is that employees are actually doing and what they're going to be assigned to do. And so OGE has created a job aid, primarily, I think, to allow ethics officials to farm this out to people who might not be intimately familiar with 2634.904 or have any desire to read 2634.904. And we've broken it down. We've taken this as a job aid where we've basically taken the criteria and we've broken it down into a series of steps and yes/no questions that you could have supervisors or other folks, anyone that you think would be appropriate to help you make these determinations with respect to a class of positions, with respect to a specific employee. And it walks them through these criteria to help you determine whether and to what extent, categories of employees or individual employees should be required to be confidential financial disclosure filers. And this job, I'm sorry, Patrick, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I would just sort of caution folks that I think this job aid is extremely useful, but an experience that I had using this job aid in an agency that was setting up a confidential financial disclosure system was that it's really important for the ethics office to offer support to supervisors. Because the experience I had was, here's this great job aid. There are a handful of yes/no questions. If you could help me understand who on your staff faces these risks, that would be great. Then we can start our confidential financial disclosure system. And the list I got back was, we're just going to have everyone file.
Said, which defeats the purpose, right?
Right. And I said, well, everyone can't be equally at risk. That seems impossible. And they said, well, I don't want to take the risk of having someone not file who should have been filing.
Right.
So I don't want to be responsible for that problem. So what I found was the supervisors in this agency were very willing to mitigate risk by spending my time as the eventual reviewer of these reports. So what we found that really worked was to ask them to put their employees into 3 categories. Definitely should file. Definitely needn't file, doesn't need to file. And maybe there's some risk. And I said, once you've done that, let's sit down and talk about this and figure out if there's really a need for all those people in the middle category to file. And what we found was some, yes, they indeed should have filed, and we designated them as filers, and they filed. And some of the people, the risk was so episodic or attenuated that they really didn't need to file. Maybe there were other things we could do to manage that risk. So if you use this, that would be our only cautions. Make sure that it's a consultative use of the tool, so that supervisors feel like they can make informed decisions, that there's someone to help them manage the risk.
And I think in addition to that, another point I would make is it's important to periodically revisit your designations because people's duties change, missions change, program areas, job responsibilities change. And so I think that it's important to have, frankly, baked into your financial disclosure processes, a periodic revisiting of your designations to make sure that you're not either over-designating or under-designating, in either direction. But I think that Patrick's point is well taken, is this is a risk assessment, and if you have an extremely risk-averse group of supervisors,
right,
you might find yourself with a list that is far longer than can actually compromise the efficiencies and the effectiveness of your confidential financial disclosure program, because you're inundated with paper that is not really serving the purpose that the system is intended to serve.
Exactly. Having a stack of forms that you don't have the time or resources to ever look at, that is merely serving to obscure the most dangerous positions, doesn't serve anyone's interest. So really the organizational interest is a little bit in tension with the risk profile of some managers. So as an ethics official, it's your job to help manage that conflict and come up with a solution that works for the agency.
Mm-hmm. And just for your reference, this resource, along with the Confidential Financial Disclosure Guide, is on our website under the Confidential Financial Disclosure tab, helpful resources for confidential financial disclosure, and you'll see this list of tools, both for filers and reviewers, to use for the confidential financial disclosure reports. We talked about who is required to file, and we said as a general proposition, it's if you're not a public filer, e.g. a GS-15 or below, and then as determined by the agency based on duties and responsibilities. There's also a specific mention in the guide itself as well as in the regulation about when and do special government employees, when are they required to file confidential financial disclosure reports. I'm just going to touch and go on this because, again, SGEs are covered fairly extensively in the guide. And if you do have questions, please, your desk officers are available to answer any questions you have. But as a general proposition, an SGE is going to file a confidential disclosure report if they meet the criteria that we just discussed, if they serve on a federal advisory committee, or if they otherwise have a substantial role in the formulation of agency policy. They will not be required to file if they're already a public financial disclosure filer, or if you have excluded them. Your agency has decided to exclude them from filing because you believe that the possibility of conflicts is remote. What I would submit to you is if you are in the throes of making some determinations about whether some of your SGEs should or shouldn't be excluded from filing, one of the things that we encounter often with SGEs, particularly ones who are being brought in for advisory roles, is there is I believe, a misapprehension that because they're coming in to provide advice, they are not in a position to actually engage in determinations or other decision making that would be critical, and therefore they're not deemed to be to have a possibility for conflicts, or their possibility for conflicts is remote. I think that's a misapprehension of the role of some advisory SGE folks. And I think that anytime you have someone who's being invited to come in to advise the agency on policy types of matters, that you really should think very seriously about whether and to what extent you can honestly say that the possibility of a conflict is remote.
Okay.
There's some additional considerations that are in the guide. I'm just going to touch and go on each of these because we are all adult human beings and we all are capable of reading ourselves. So I'm not going to read the guide to you. There are provisions in 904, 2634, 904 for supplemental reporting requirements. So, and this can reach even to public financial disclosure filers. So agencies have the ability, with subject to prior approval from OGE, to require some filers to report additional information over and above what is required on a public financial disclosure report, or to file, according to supplemental regulations, additional confidential information. That's what that's making reference to. Exclusions from filing, agencies within your discretion have the ability to exclude positions from filing. That is within your purview. 904B explains what those exclusion authorities are. And then finally, the review of confidential filer status. This is basically what are the appeal rights of an employee who believes that they have inappropriately been designated as a confidential financial disclosure filer. And again, you'll find that in 2634-906, as well as in the review guide.
And I think these considerations as a body make a lot of sense because they're really a further articulation of the responsibilities of agencies to run programs that suit their needs. So not only do you have a lot of discretion about who files these reports, you also have a lot of discretion about what gets filed, when it gets filed, which instructions are used, what kind of information you're collecting. So that really, if you have situations that aren't well covered by our OGE Form 450 and you need different information, well, you can work with OGE to make sure you get that different information because, again, what we're trying to do here is prevent those conflicts of interest.
Absolutely, and that teed up beautifully what our next slide says, which is what actually gets filed. And I think, Patrick, you've sort of, knocked it right on the head of why it matters. Like, why do we care what kind of form you actually file? And that's because these systems are designed to, in some respects, be tailored to your reality on the ground. Now, for many, many people, and most agencies are using the OGE Form 450. Most filers file an OGE Form 450. And that serves the purpose for most agencies and for most individual employees. But if it doesn't, there is an ability for the agency to craft an alternative reporting format, an alternative reporting system for folks if the OGE Form 450 doesn't give you the kind of information that you need to do a conflicts analysis. If it's giving you too much information and just not enough of the right kind. So with prior approval from OGE, now it is something that is subject to OGE approval, you can tailor a system that meets the needs for maybe just a certain category of employee in your organization. Maybe the 450 works for most, but you have a certain type of employee that for whom an alternative reporting format would be more appropriate. That's completely within your authority, again with approval from OGE,
Right.
to craft that and to tailor these programs to better serve the purpose they're intended for.
Right. And I think when we look at the kinds of information the 450 collects, it's very well suited to people who are in positions like contracting officers. It's very well suited to people who are maybe investigating or regulating outside industry companies. But where you have conflicts that arise from different kinds of relationships, like maybe in your scientific communities, it may be appropriate to collect different information. And here we allow for that possibility as long as you have concurrence with OGE that what you're collecting makes sense and that we concur with you. But that's, I think, an important feature because we can't possibly know all of the ways that conflicts of interest can arise for executive branch officials from our seats here at OGE.
One final note, though, and I do want to emphasize this, is that the OGE optional form 450A may no longer be used. We have discontinued the use of that form. Now, what we have told folks is that if you would like to craft your own version of what had been the form 450A, that would be considered an alternative reporting format, and you would have to go through the same sort of approval processes that you would for any sort of an alternative report or system. But if folks out there would like to craft your own, you may do so, but you simply may not any longer use the OGE optional form 450A.
Okay.
So we're gonna go to the guide now. We're gonna pull up the guide itself because we're gonna talk about types of reports and filing deadlines. So why do we care about filing deadlines, Patrick? Well, what, other than the nuisance of having to report things by a certain, time certain, why do we care about filing deadlines?
Well, I think it's very important for us to be able to review these forms and advise employees before conflicts occur. So, I tend to start with the need to file that new entrant report. The timely filing of the new entrant report is very, very important. And we realize that the practicalities of filing the new entrant mean that people will often be in the job for a little bit of time before they actually submit the form. And we have taken some steps in the new regulations to try and mitigate that by requiring you to include information about the ethics rules in job announcements and offer letters and the like. But really, the sooner you can get information about the potential for conflict for a new employee, the more helpful you can be to that employee in avoiding conflicts of interest. So I think that's sort of foundational. But then the periodicity of this is also important because people's financial situations change and their duties change. So we need some mechanism for a periodic reconsideration of these facts because they may have changed without us or our employees realizing the significance of those changes. So I think that's really why our system functions the way it does. And I think particularly with the new entrant, the worst situation we can find ourselves in is to have someone file a new entrant late and you realize they already have had a problem. There's already been a conflict of interest. Or they're moving in the direction of a conflict of interest and some work is terribly harmed because of the kinds of actions or changes the organizations can have to make in the way, say, a project is staffed. So, I think that timeliness is sort of foundational to the system. But then the periodic reconsideration of this is helpful because things change.
So I think this is something that we really need to sort of focus on when we're looking at the due dates particularly for new entrant reports. And new entrant filings are tricky. We know that from an administrative standpoint, this is one of the hardest things for agencies to make sure they're getting right and they're getting a timely notification of the onboarding of new employees. This is an area where it's really critical to have a good working relationship with whatever part of your organization can assist you in identifying these folks as quickly as possible. Because I think if we consider a new entrant filing kind of like getting a baseline, a baseline sense of the health of the individual and the work that they're going to be doing, and sort of the annual report being their yearly checkup to make sure that everything's okay. But we want to start out with a good, clean baseline. report
Right.
for the individual to make sure that, ethically speaking, they're healthy to move forward with the work that they're going to be doing. And so time is of the essence with that. So while the new entrant has to be filed within 30 days of assuming the duties of the covered position, I think we all recognize that assuming the covered position can take on a variety of forms. So I want to talk just briefly about the ways in which new entrants occur. New entrants can occur if you're bringing in someone new to the agency. So it is a new hire from outside of the agency. And a new entrant report can be triggered by that in two separate ways. One, you do have the ability to prospectively ask individuals to file a 450 in consideration for the position, such that you're actually looking at it before the offer is being extended. So that's one way to capture new hires and maybe do that for really high-risk folks. But then there's also the people who are coming in that are newly hired that have been onboarded, and you got to find out about them within 30 days of their actually coming on board. I think that's one of the areas where I think people have some difficulty.
Right.
But that's not even the most difficult kinds of new hires, or new entrants, I should say. New entrants can also be people who are already within your organization, and they have either been promoted into a position that's a covered position, that's a confidential filing position. So they were previously encumbering a non-filing position, and now through some mechanism they are now encumbering a filing position. Finding out about those folks can be particularly tricky. But the same 30 days of assuming the covered position still applies for those new entrant filers, and they are new entrant filers unless they're coming from a covered position.
No, and I think this is a good example of this being an agency program. It's not an agency ethics office program. It requires the cooperation of a lot of people within your organization to make it function properly. And part of the challenge of getting that accomplished is making sure that these other officials in your organizations, your supervisors, your human resources officers, understand the importance of this work. Because if they don't understand the reason for doing this, it's very difficult for them to decide how to prioritize the work. So if you go to them and you say, I need to know this so that this person can fill out this form. Well, if they don't know why we fill out the form or the danger of not getting the form, it's very difficult to assess whether or not that should be a priority or not. So I think it's important that everyone, when we're talking about this system to others and organizations, understand what we're trying to accomplish and for whose benefit we're trying to accomplish this. Because really this is an effort by the ethics office to protect the integrity of the work of the agency. We don't really do this for the health of the ethics office, right?
Right. And the final new entrant situation, I think, which may very well be the hardest of all, is when you have an employee who, for whatever reason, maybe is temporarily performing duties within their current position. So their position isn't currently designated as a filing position,
Right.
but for whatever reason, they have assumed certain duties for a year or for 2 years that actually now put them in a position where they probably should be filing a confidential financial disclosure form. Now that's a situation where really your supervisors would be the ones who would be best situated to sort of spot that,
Right.
and to alert you to the fact that an employee has now assumed duties that should require them to file an OGE Form 450. But just so that we're all, sort of thinking about the manifold ways in which a new entrant report can become required.
Right.
Now, the rest of the guide talks about exceptions to the filing requirement. I'm not going to read you the guide again. So the information about the exceptions to the filing requirement are there. The reporting periods for the new entrant report are also listed at the bottom there. What I just described about somebody acquire or having new duties is actually discussed on page 10 under newly designated positions, where it says that if an agency has already determined that the duties of a position require financial disclosure prior to an employee's entry into a position, the employee files a new entrant report upon assuming the duties. But, however, an agency may make this determination for a position that an employee already occupies. And the incumbent employee in this case would file a new entrant report within 30 days of the agency designating the position as requiring confidential financial disclosure. So in every single one of these iterations that I talked about, the same applies. The 30-day gets triggered by the designation to a covered position. So that's all elaborated here in the guide itself.
Yeah, and I think administratively this is challenging, but the reason it's challenging isn't because OG is being mean to you.
Right.
It's challenging because the conflict profile of individuals within your organization is a dynamic situation.
It is dynamic, yes.
People's duties change. Positions become vacant. People take on and divide up those duties, and sometimes they bring with them the potential for conflict of interest. And to the greatest extent possible, it's in your agency's interest to manage that potential for conflict of interest. We know it's not going to work perfectly in every case, but we do want to suggest that you should make every effort to do that, because the prevention of conflicts really redounds to the benefit of the agency and its programs. And that's what we're really trying to do here.
And again, I think that to the greatest extent that you can have supervisors and others on the ground who are experiencing this in a timely way, to be the eyes and ears and to have some sensibility and awareness that it is part of their duty to maybe spot for some of this stuff. That way you're not having to rely entirely on formal processes. You can rely on informal awareness to help you identify these situations.
And just a sort of quick note, as we're approaching the end of the calendar year, and next year's new training year begins January 1, this is a good area of training for supervisors. If you do special training for supervisors, helping them to detect situations where there's a change in the conflict profile among their staff members and training them to alert the ethics office is a very valuable set of skills that you can help them develop. So if that's something that you think your organization needs, consider including that in your training plan for supervisors this year.
That's an excellent suggestion. Yeah. So the other reporting category under 450 filing is annual reports. And again, the criteria for the requirement to file is here. If you've served in a position for more than 60 days during a calendar year, you file an annual report the following February 15th of the following year. We talk about how do you count the number of consecutive calendar days for purposes of that 60-day mark. The guide also talks about, what are exceptions to the filing requirement, and the biggest exception to the filing requirement is effectively that there is no termination report required. That if someone terminates the position before the annual report is due, there is no report due. So unlike the public financial disclosure system, we have an annual or an incumbent filing, but we do not have a termination filing. The reporting period is listed here. We're going to be discussing that more when we get into the actual form itself over the next two sessions. Moving between covered positions, I think this is a good thing for you to review. If you do have people who if you tend to lend people to agencies, or people are moving to your agency from another agency, this articulates who should collect the report. Sharing between agencies for people who are moving between agencies, sharing copies of reports that have been filed. All of that is discussed here in the guide. I just want to highlight that and alert you to it. So if you have people who move from one agency to the other, this will give you some guidance on how to handle their filing requirements. Now, the next page, on page 11, we give considerable time and attention to this, and I would just encourage you that if you have special government employees who are operating within your organization, their filing requirements are quite unique. SGEs will always and only file a new entrant confidential financial disclosure report. They do it within 30 days of starting their covered position, and then if they are reappointed or redesignated each year, they file a new entrant report each year upon that redesignation or reappointment. They always only ever file a new entrant report. There are multiple exceptions to the filing requirements that, again, I'm not going to cover in any detail here, because I think it would behoove you, if you have SGEs, to get very familiar with the guidance that's in this particular guide. Due date considerations as well. This is particularly with respect to Federal Advisory Committee Act folks. They're required to file their reports before they render any advice. or an event no later than the first committee meeting. So if your SGEs happen to be FACA Advisory Committee SGEs, there are special considerations for those folks. So, for SGEs, a lot of the difficulty and complexity here is that different things apply depending upon the type of SGE or the service that they're performing. If they're just someone who happens to be basically a part-time or temporary appointment person, but they're not serving in an advisory committee capacity, right. The considerations are different than they would be for someone serving on a Federal Advisory Committee Act committee. So I just strongly encourage you to thoroughly peruse the guide and the instructions that are in the guide.
No, I think that's a good point, because I think a lot of folks think that the special government employee category is some magical category that creates special responsibilities and freedoms and filing requirements and what have you, but really all it is a designation about how many days someone works.
Yes.
Right? It's a counting exercise. It tells you how many days someone is expected to work in a year. So the similarities and differences between people who are expected to serve less than a full-time capacity are just as various and sundry as they are with any other category of employee. So making categorical statements about the filing requirements of special government employees is as ridiculous as making categorical statements about the filing requirements of full-time employees.
Yes.
Because it's really just an exercise in how many days do you come to the office, and that doesn't have any bearing on the kinds of work you might do.
Yeah, exactly. So just pay extra special attention if you do have any SGEs, whether they're advisory committee SGEs or not. Pay special attention to this section of the guide, because it does make reference to some informal advisory opinions that OGE has rendered on the subject as well. In addition to the common situations that we encounter, which are new entrant filers, annual filers, and then SGE filers, who are their own special brand of new entrant filer. We also address in the guide situations when someone is serving in an acting capacity. If you have situations where you have someone who is temporarily assigned duties in a position that has been designated as a covered position, this part of the guide is going to help walk you through when a new entrant report would be triggered by that acting capacity functioning, and when an annual report would be required, depending upon how long the person was in the acting capacity. Again, if these are situations that you find yourself in, the guide addresses it expressly.
Right. And the reason we're concerned with acting capacity is because we're really concerned with the potential for conflict.
Yes.
And someone can have a potential for conflict when they're acting in a position just as easily if they encumber the position on a full-time no terminus date basis.
Precisely.
Right. So we need to be concerned about that equally.
Yeah, it's the duties of the position that are triggering the filing, and if you are even temporarily assuming the duties of the position, then you are ipso facto encumbering a position that the agency has determined is at a risk for conflict of interest, and so a Form 450 or some financial disclosure, a confidential financial disclosure report is required. In addition, we have many times folks get detailed from one federal agency to another. And so again, we've incorporated some guidance in this document with respect to how do we handle an individual who's been detailed to another agency. And we talk about what happens if, and we consider each of these circumstances. If the individual is a filer in their host agency, but they're not going to be a filer in the agency to which they've been detailed. If, conversely, the employee is detailed to a position that's going to be a covered position, although they didn't hold a covered position in their host agency, and the situation where they are going to be encumbering a covered position in both places. Right. So if you have any of those iterations of that situation, we discuss it in this section of the guide.
Right. And I think when you read the guide, you'll see that it's directed towards managing the conflicts wherever they apply. Because you left a position where there was no risk of conflict and you went to a position where there is risk of conflict, yes, we still need to manage that situation.
Right. And I think that there's always some question about the level of cooperation that should exist between agencies in terms of sharing these, and who should take responsibility for collecting the report. And we address that. We address that in the guide. And to the extent that your question doesn't seem to be explicitly answered by the guidance in the guide, then we would obviously tell you, please contact your desk officer, and your desk officer can help you suss through whatever peculiar fact pattern you might have that if the guide is not helping you to answer whatever question you have. The guide also talks about Intergovernmental Personnel Act detailees. We know this is an issue when folks are bringing in people from outside of government, and also when people are sending their folks out to detailee positions outside of government. So this addresses briefly the Intergovernmental Personnel Act detailee situations. And then finally, individuals who are not government employees. We often get questions about whether and to what extent contractor employees or members of federal advisory committees who are not considered to be employees, whether and to what extent agencies are permitted to collect confidential financial disclosure forms from them. The answer is, generally speaking, you may not. They are not employees and they are not subject to these requirements. But just if you have questions about that, know that the guide also addresses that issue as well. Okay. So the final aspect of that we want to talk to you about are making sure that you have agency written procedures. So everything that we've talked about up to this point, from designating filers and how you go about designating them, how often you revisit your designations, to what forms you're using, to whether or not you're using any alternative reporting requirements, to what are your policies for identifying, collecting new entrant reports and annual reports and reports from your SGEs. All of those things should be reduced to writing in a document which contains all of that, your procedures for doing all of that. So for identification, collection, and review, it should also include any discussion of extensions and penalties. Under the regulation, and the guide also talks about this as well, starting on page 15, talks about the agency's responsibility and authority to issue filing extensions for filers, what the criteria are for that, what the number of days are that you're authorized to do that. That's discussed in the guide. It includes the service in combat zone or service during a period of national emergency extension provisions. If you're implementing those as well, that would be something that you would want to reduce or have included in your written procedures. While there are no filing penalties under the confidential financial disclosure system as there are under the public financial disclosure system, agencies may still are authorized to take what you consider to be appropriate action, which could include an adverse action against an employee who has not filed or has filed a false or incomplete or late report. So you have the authority to engage in some form of penalty administration, right, even though it's not a filing fee like we have under the public financial disclosure system.
Exactly. The law doesn't specify what the penalty is, but all of those administrative tools that your agency has to gain compliance with management directives are available to you. And it's important not to forget that because, again, if we don't receive the information in a timely way, we cannot assist employees in avoiding conflicts of interest, which means we can't assist the agency in avoiding conflicts of interest.
Exactly. And then finally, there are records management issues are also addressed in the guide, and that's also something that should be included in your agency written procedures, which is how are you allowing for access to your forms? How are you protecting them from access? And how are you allowing the forms to be used? And then ultimately, there is a retention period that you're required to retain the reports, but there's also a requirement to destroy them
yes.
once you have
exceeded indefinitely.
Once you've exceeded the retention period. So again, that's discussed in the guide, and those are also things that should be included in your agency written procedures. And do you want to expand a little bit too, Patrick, on, OGE, when it comes out to do a program review, is most definitely going to look to and ask you for your written procedures.
That is a good reason.
That is a good reason. But what is an overarching good reason for?
We see this all the time. So one of the most disruptive things that happen to agency ethics programs is turnover in the personnel who administer the program. And if you don't have sound written procedures, that turnover can be sort of catastrophic to the functioning of the program. So having good written procedures is really good succession planning. it also allows you to formalize the relationships you need to make this program work. You cannot run an effective confidential system out of the ethics office if you're in a program of any size. Unless you personally know everyone in the organization and what they're up to all the time, you're going to need some help somewhere, be that designation, notification of personnel changes, awareness of what the duties and responsibilities of the positions are. Good procedures allow you to document and make durable those relationships and those vectors of cooperation. So they can really be a benefit to your program to have this stuff formalized so that everyone agrees on what their roles and responsibilities are in the agency's confidential financial disclosure program.
Absolutely. So Patrick has just beautifully articulated all the reasons why agency written procedures are really to your benefit. It is not just a bureaucratic exercise that OGE wants to come in and take a look at. It is for the benefit and the continuity of your program, and it is useful, I think, to be able to pull it out when you are if you're having to rebuild or build a new relationships with other parts of the organization. If you have standing agreements with those organizations that you have reduced to writing in your agency written procedures, it gives you something concrete to point to. It may be a point of negotiation with that organization,
it will be a point of negotiation.
Because it'll be a dynamic document, as are all of these types of documents.
But once you've done that work, to capture that is really good. It really helps to strengthen those relationships and strengthen those ways of cooperating.
Okay. So that is our overview of the system for today. If you can join us, if you're able to join us next Tuesday, we're going to be talking about the form. And if you look at section 2 of the guide, that's really what we're going to be relying upon as our guide for next week's session. We're going to be walking through every part of the form and discussing, what it is, why it is, what you should likely see there, so that you can know in anticipation. And you can better advise employees as to how they can best fill out the form.
No, excellent. So we hope you can all join us next week for part 2 of this broadcast. This, like all broadcasts, recording will be available on the course page immediately upon the conclusion. If you found this to be too basic an understanding, feel free to use this with other members of your staff.
Absolutely.
These become on-demand resources as soon as we're done with the live broadcast, and we want them to be tools that agencies can use for the professional development of the ethics officials in their agencies. So we hope you do that.
And we've given you a pretty version of the slides as well, so that if you want to do it, if you want to give your employees something that's a little visually more attractive than the slides that we shared with you today, we've given you the pretty copy as well.
Absolutely. So thanks very much for joining us today, Cheryl, and thanks to all of you, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Thanks.